Good evening and welcome to this, the latest educational session of the Republican Labour Education Forum. Today we're looking at a case for a left populist party, and Steve is going to be presenting his ideas on this topic. So over to you, Steve.
Okay, thanks, Carl. I'm just going to sort out a share. Thank you, Carol, for that. Okay, comrades, what I'm going to talk about, and I will just tell you the points I'm going to cover now. I'm going to cover. I'm going to root down to about four points. I want to start with an interview that George Galloway had. We'll look at that in a minute with Crispin Flintoff. And make some comments on what George Galloway is saying, because although I've got a lot of differences with George, I think he's making some important and valid points. I then want to briefly talk about the state that we're in. Where are we now in 2025 here in England? What are some key things that we need to take into account? And then from that, I want to talk about, well, what is populism? What does it actually mean? And then to draw some conclusions from that. Okay, so those are the things that I want to cover. And the first one, and this gone to this, Carol, which is going to be this one, George Galloway, a case for left populism. Now, I think.
But and of course, Freud coined the phrase narcissism of the small difference. And much of the British left, maybe the left as a whole, is in the possession of that narcissism of the small difference. So I might use different pronouns to you. I might have a different view on Love Island to you. That makes you my enemy who must be destroyed. Even though on so many important things, we actually agree. And if we could get our act together, we might actually have a chance of changing things. So that's been the story of the left to date. Might not always be. Maybe one day a group, a person, a set of tactics and strategies will coalesce, will come together and sweep all before it, but maybe not. I think that Britain is in a very difficult situation. Both of the mainstream parties are completely discredited, Labour and the Conservatives. But the rising tide is with Reform, which is the British equivalent of the AFD in Germany. It's the British equivalent of Marine Le Pen in France. It's the British equivalent of Trump. It's Trump plus, but still Trump. That's the rising tide. Right populism is looking like it's unstoppable for this period. We have to develop a left populism which competes against it in language that the mass of the people can understand and relate to. You know, the perambulations of left-wing people in Britain. I've been on the left in Britain for more than 50 years. On the anti-During program or on the intricacies of the writings and thinkings of long dead Germans and Russians. It doesn't mean a damn thing to 99.9% of the British population. We have a left whose preoccupations, whose style of work, whose style of speaking, whose style of writing, whose style of thinking is so last century, even the century before that. It has nothing to do with the new generation. As things have worked out, I have 5 young children. And my first child has 5 children. So I'm around a lot of young people. Right. I know what they think like, I know what they talk like. And it ain't like what you and I talk like and think like. And you're one of the more far-sighted and progressive. It's a kind of parallel universe. And unless we get with that program, John Lennon wrote in the song in the 60s, a song called Revolution, if you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't going to make it with anyone anyhow. Well, think 60 years on what the equivalents of that are, and that's where we are as a British left, and it's where we've got to get off that path.
George Galloway and the case for left populism. Yeah, I just want to emphasise I essentially agree with the thesis that George Galloway is making there, and he highlights a few points. So let me just emphasise one or two of them. One, Britain is in a very difficult situation. We all know that, but I want to say something about that difficult situation because it's really important. Secondly, he says that it's the rising tide is with the right. It's right-wing populism that is making headway in Britain with the Reform Party and across Europe. And he then goes on to say that we have to develop, he says, a left populism that competes against it in a language that the mass of people can understand and relate to. He then goes on to do a kind of critique of what he thinks that the socialist movement is so out of touch, essentially, with where people are and can't relate to them in what he says is our preoccupations, our style of work, our style of speaking, our style of writing and thinking, etc., is so last century, he says. So there's a way in which we relate to a broader mass of the population. We're not really we're not doing that very effectively. And then towards the end, he says, what is our task? And he says our task is to properly analyze the state that we're in and what is needed to affect it. So I'm not agreeing with every word he said, that the general thesis that he's put there, I think that we should take seriously and take it up. So I'm gonna work on that, on the thesis that he has there. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to start with this diagram first of all. So here we are in England in 2025, and I think that sets up where we are. We have got the established centre ground, the centre right and the centre left. Whether the Labour Party is now centre right or centre left, whatever, we can all discuss. But they are His Majesty's government. So in the yellow is the central ground of British politics. Over on the right, we have right populism, which, as we know, is represented, I suppose we'd say, by the Reform Party. And then over on the left, I'll come on to that in a minute. And then outside of that, we have English fascism on one side, Tommy Robinson and co. And then we have the English Marxist movement, maybe the English communists, we might say, a whole different range of groups there in that. So let's just think about this question of George Galloway talking about left populism. What have we got in terms of left populism in England? Well, we've got reform. We'll take those out just to make the picture a little simpler. We've got a little arrow. Let's just look at left populism for a minute and concentrate on that. What have we got in terms of what I would call left populism? I think left populism in England is a number of organisations. It's not a unified party. We've got the Workers' Party of Great Britain. That's George's party. We've got this organisation called Collective that has gathered up a whole number of organisations. Then I think we have the Independent Alliance, the MPs, which is basically Jeremy Corbyn and the four other MPs that were elected in the 2024 general election. And then we have another grouping called Assemble, which is doing a lot of grassroots kind of democracy. So I think that all of those organisations are sort of floating around in this space that I would call left populism. I had another one, and I wasn't sure, Jeremy Corbyn's Peace and Justice. I'm not sure that is trying to be a party, so that possibly that does not figure in this particular story. But I suppose the thing that you might even then observe is that these different organisations haven't managed to unite themselves in any sort of, I don't think, any particularly coherent way at the moment. So let's now take the first thing that George argued, said. He said, let's consider the state we're in. What are the objective conditions in which we find ourselves? What are the objective conditions? We need to know that to understand what is possible and what we need to do. So I'm just going to briefly cover what we've talked about quite a lot in this group about the nature of the state that we are currently in. We use the term social monarchy, and we use that term, and we're saying that this social monarchy is in crisis. It's important to understand, if we understand the nature of the social monarchy, the depth of the crisis that we're in. George says we must properly analyse the state we're in. Now, we use the term social monarchy to describe the post-war 1945 welfare state. It wasn't just a welfare state, it was also a constitutional monarchy. And more than anything else, the Queen Elizabeth, came to symbolise that post-war settlement. And we can think of the NHS, we can think of the BBC, and we can think of the Queen Elizabeth II, as symbolic of that post-war period that most of us were born in and have been living through. And it's a very powerful concept forged through the Second World War. Gramsci uses the term to describe an ideology as being an organic ideology, something that kind of takes grip, takes hold of society, shapes what we see in terms of our culture, our values, our attitudes, and everything. That is what we had in the post-war society that we lived through the 1950s, 60s, 70s into the 80s, and it's still with us now, by the way. But what we've pointed out is that the neoliberal, so-called neoliberal revolution, the free market revolution that came in with Thatcher and was continued by Blair, who Thatcher said was my most important creation, they began to completely dismantle this social monarchy, this welfare state. And that dismantling of the welfare state, the privatization, the deregulation, the cuts in spending, trying to shrink the state, and all these other things of neoliberalism has gone on since 1979, right the way up, I'd say, to the banking crisis of 2007, 2008. And at that point, the whole system has blown up with a massive, massive crisis of the banking system. And the state had to pump billions and billions to save the banks. But subsequently, of course, we lived through a whole epoch of austerity. And that epoch, this new period after 2007, we've called the degeneration of the social monarchy, by which we mean it's not just a crisis, it's something, it's putrefying, it's just simply collapsing, it's eating itself. It's going into a situation where it can't survive. You know, it's in the death agony, if you like, of that post-war system. It's not yet dead, but it's almost dead. Now, Gramsci used the term to describe this as an organic crisis, a deep crisis, an organic crisis in the system. And he uses a phrase, and Michael Gove actually used this phrase as well. He says we're living in an interregnum, if you like, between two kings, I suppose that strictly means, but between two states, where the old system of social monarchy is dying, and yet a new system cannot be born. And he says during that time, and the reason why it cannot be born is because we're not ready for it. We've not decided what we want to put in its place. So we're kind of stuck. And Gramsci says, during that time, a great variety of morbid symptoms can appear. Morbid symptoms of putrefaction, failure, collapse, continuing going downhill. So the prediction of this is not that Starmer's bad, it's just the system that he's operating in. He cannot but go downhill. This Labour government will take us further down this path of degeneration because it's not going to be able to in a position to reverse what the death agony, the collapse, the putrefaction of this post-war settlement. And nobody's come up with any idea as to what should replace it. So I would say to George Galloway, if you want to discuss the state we're in, we have to understand this nature of this system that we've had and what are we going to do about that. And any left populist party, I would say, has to think about this and has to think about what's going to replace this broken system. So that is the first point that I want to make about that. We're in this period of crisis. Now, the next point is, and I agree with George, a mass party is needed. Now, what do we mean by a mass party? Well, I don't know what we mean by a mass party, but I think it has to have tens or hundreds of thousands of members, and it has to be capable of winning millions of votes. Now, that's something that can't be magicked out of thin air. We just can't go, oh, click our fingers and we'll get thousands of members and millions of votes. Obviously, it has to be built up over a period of time. But the example of Reform, I would say Reform has become a mass party. It's got tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of members, certainly tens of thousands, large number of members, and it's expected to get millions of votes. I think it got maybe 4 million votes at the last election, something like that. Maybe it was 6. I don't know the exact number. It doesn't really matter. But Reform is a mass party. It's broken out. It's not just a tiny little fringe party that we know on the left. It's a mass party. And a mass party is needed. And I would argue that a mass party is both possible and necessary. Why necessary? Because it's only if we organise people can we resist this drift to the right. Only if we can get mobilised millions of members, only if we can get millions of votes, can we really put a stop to this general drift that this country is going to the right. Because going to the right, going to Reform, going to fascism is the drift of the country in this period of degeneration of our social monarchy. That's the direction of travel. And so we have to have a mass party. And why is it possible? Well, I give 2 reasons to think why a mass party would be possible. One is the experience of the Corbyn movement. Jeremy Corbyn managed to get hundreds of thousands of members. He managed to get 11 million, 12 million people to vote for the Labour Party. Now, I know they were Labour Party members. I don't mean you can just magically take all those 11 or 10 million to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. It's not as simple as that. But what he showed was there can be a leftish kind of populist movement that gets a lot of votes. And if you remember, the membership of the Labour Party went up to 500,000 under Jeremy Corbyn. So that's the first reason. It's been done. You know, it's not the same to just repeat that, but it has been done. And I think the second really important factor is that we have a mass movement on the streets because of Palestine. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are out on the streets supporting Palestine week after week after week. And you think, well, what does that mean? In the 2024 general election, there were 5 independent MPs elected. How did they get to be elected? They got to be elected because of Palestine. They got to be elected because they made support for Palestine one of them central points that they were making. So I would say, objectively, what George Galloway is saying is correct, that we do need a mass party, we do need to counter, and it's possible and it's necessary if we're going to stop the general drift to the right. Okay. So I think those are 2 things that I want to say about the objective condition. Let me just say this next point, really, just to compare left and right populism for a minute. And then I'm going to look at what we mean by populism. Okay, first thing, I'm going to do it in colours. I like to do things in colours. Okay, what do we really mean by right populism? What's the example of right populism? Well, for right populism, I think we've got red, white and blue. We've got the Union flag. I think we've got the Rule Britannia. We've got Land of Hope and Glory. So a right populist party is a kind of English party. I think Reform is a party really English. It's really basically an English party, but it's British as well. It's that kind of strange mix of being British and English. And Farage is a very English politician, you know, symbolically of that party, where its base is in England. And its base came out of, I think, leaving the European Union, Brexit, etc., from the Brexit party. So I think that's the essential element of right-wing populism, has those characteristics. What am I going to say about left populism? Well, I think a true left populism would have to be English republicanism and internationalism. It'd have to have those characteristics. So I'm not going to go red, white and blue. I'm not going to go into those colours particularly. All the comrades here will know about the colours and what they represent in terms of English democracy. So I think we've got a complete colour clash here. That's basically what we've got between that. And so if I'm going to do a critique of George Galloway at this point, I would say George Galloway is definitely too red, white, and blue. That's really, he's the wrong colours, and that's because he's trying to do a kind of British populism, and I think that is the objective. The state we're in is not British at the moment. So I think that there is anyway. I won't leave it there with just colours for the moment, because I want to ask the question: what is populism? What do we mean by that term? So, quite simply, I think the most important characteristic of populism is it sets up the idea of the people versus the ruling class, or it could be the elites. You didn't really call it the ruling class; you could call it the ruling elite, or just the liberal elite. Sometimes it's called. But there is the idea that the people are being betrayed or sold out or not being listened to, and it's the ruling elites that are doing that. Now, right-wing populism does that, as does left populism, I would argue. Both of them do that, but in rather different ways. And the difference between Reform and the Tory party is it's easy to think the Tory party is a party of the ruling class. It always has been. It's not a populist party, even though politicians like Boris Johnson have played populist arguments, sang populist songs. Thatcher herself did that. The Tories sing populism, but Reform, being an independent party, a party independent of the Tory party, can pose itself as the champion of the people against the ruling elites, and that's a characteristic of the right populism and of left. So, what is populism? Well, essentially, for me, it's something about people power, popular sovereignty, and it's about the antagonism, the fact there's conflict between the people. It's not just the people; there are people and elites. That the people and the interests of the elites are in contradiction to each other. The term populism goes right the way back to the Roman Republic, and the people were and the political currents that were called populares. There was populism in the Roman people appealing to the plebs, as it were, against the aristocracy, the Roman aristocracy. That's the origin of the word populism. It goes back as far as that. And I suppose to say that the dynamic of this is that the dynamic is of the people struggling. It's not the same as capital versus wage labour. It's the people versus the elites. So when reform does the people, when the reform presents itself as the voice of the people against the elites, they're not talking about capital versus wage labour. In fact, it's an alternative. They see that as that. So they're posing that as an alternative. Left populism is different, because I think that in left populism, we can talk about the working class being an important component of the people. And indeed, we can talk of the working class leading the people, playing a key role in populism, not set against it. So right-wing populism is anti-working class. Left-wing populism sees the working class having a positive role in leading the struggle. The people being the vanguard. The working class is the vanguard because it's organised, because it's in trade unions, etc. So they can play that role of being the leading force in any struggle. So I suppose you could say right-wing populism is really billionaire populism. It's the populism of the capitalist class. They want to attract the people to their side because they know that people are alienated, so they need to get a safety valve. The people are alienated from the Tory party, the people are alienated from the Labour Party, and so the billionaires have set up another trap for people to trap them to the right and set up that thing. Whereas I'd say simply left populism, on the other hand, is about the working class and the people together. and the people include students and pensioners and small shopkeepers and etc. You know, so that's the idea of it. Now, next point I really want to make, I think, is this. Oh, right, populism. We've had that point. Yeah, that's gone. Theories of populism. Now, I want to briefly say, and only briefly talk about theories of populism. Now, you might say, well, why do we need a theory? What's the point in having? So, in others, some people might say, let's just everybody get together, throw in a few things into the pot, and we'll call that left populism. We'll call that a left populist party, because these are the things that are popular. Now, I think I think we need to be better than that. I think that theory is a guide to action. The point about theory is that you're learning from history, you're learning from actual examples of things that have happened already, and you're going to use that as a guide to action. So to answer George Galloway, we have to say, okay, George, I go on with what you're saying, but what does this actually mean? What are the examples that we want to gain from? What do we want to learn from to apply it to make the best form of a left populist party? And I think we've got three important sources of left populism. One is republicanism. That's the kind of work we've been doing in understanding and developing historically republicanism, going right the way back to the English Civil War, to the French Revolution, to the Paris Commune, all those other things that we've talked about in this education forum, all about the nature of republicanism, about liberty, democracy, solidarity, equality, all those Republican values. Another source of left populism is Gramsci's prison notebooks, because when Gramsci was imprisoned by Mussolini, he went into it. He started to do some very deep thinking about what had gone wrong, and he began to realize. And Russell was talking to me about this the other day. He's been reading some stuff on Gramsci. Gramsci came to conclusions that the communist parties and the socialist parties had not been able to connect with a mass of people. That's why they were defeated by Mussolini. And he started to adopt a Republican perspective. He came to Republican conclusions. He talked about taking seriously the nation, taking seriously people. He used the term national popular. And then there are a group of what might be called post-Marxists, people who come from a Marxist tradition, but have drawn. They say we've gone beyond Marxism, but it doesn't really matter. Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe are two of the people who've written quite a bit of theory from South America, where Laclau comes from the populism of South America and Argentina, and Chantal Mouffe's talking more about populism in Europe, for example, Podemos in Spain, and other sort of left populist parties. So those are sources that we can, theoretical sources, knowledge that we can draw on if we want to construct a party, a left populist party. Right, let's just take about three more points and then we'll draw this to a close. First of all, left populism takes the nation and what Gramsci called national popular very, very seriously. A lot of the left tend to dismiss nations because they think, well, under communism won't be any nations, so why bother taking them seriously now? You know, let's just remember we're internationalists, we're cosmopolitans, we're globalists, we don't do nations. But that is quite a deeply embedded idea. Gramsci thought that was wrong, and I would argue that Marx and Lenin and many of those people also thought that was wrong. Nations exist and are a real factor in mass politics. They are imagined communities, but they are real. The working class, there's an international class, but the working class is born and brought up in different places, a different culture. And so we have to take that very, very seriously, and the left generally doesn't. When we start talking about England, people think we've gone off our trolleys. You know, why are we talking about England? We've gone mad. Nobody's going to talk about England. And that shows that we're not connecting to where the people that we want to address actually are in their thinking. We've gone into some abstract idea that we don't belong anywhere and we're not, all that sort of stuff. So that's important. This is what Gramsci emphasised in his what he called the Nazionale Popolare. He was against what he called a superficial cosmopolitanism and anti-patriotism. And when you look at both Marx and Trotsky, they didn't go down this line of imagining that nations didn't exist. And I won't do it now, but I have quotes from Marx and Trotsky to support this point of view. There's a famous quote, I'll just mention this, from Marx, where he goes to a meeting and some French comrades get up and say, we're not doing nations, we don't believe in nations, we don't want to talk about them at all, because we're internationalists. And Marx turns around and says to them, oh, that's very funny, but you don't realize you just talked in French, which is a language that half this meeting don't even understand. So although you declare yourself you're not interested in nations, you are still speaking as French people. He points up the irony of that. So Marx was very keen that we took national questions seriously, like he did on Ireland, like he did on Poland and other places. But of course, nations are not fixed. They are invented and they are reinvented, which is why we have the slogan, Another England. England is not a fixed thing. It's not a white country. It's not a waspy, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant country. We have to contest that. The class struggle is also about defining what kind of country we're living in and what kind of country we want to be. So populism takes the nation seriously, and it breaks with that idea that we don't need to do this. And I want to mention the distinction, I think, between nationalism and patriotism, which is a very important distinction that we are. Well, this is a difficult area for many of us on the left to think about, but we need to do that. George Orwell talks about this distinction between patriotism and nationalism. And he thinks that patriotism, which is love of country, it's not hatred of anybody. It's that you love your country, you love the people, you have something which is a positive. Patriotism is a positive thing. Whereas he thinks that nationalism is the hatred of everybody else. You love your country, you're going to kill everybody else everywhere else. And so he's keen to say that patriotism is a kind of much more healthier thing. Nationalism can be dangerous. The term originally for patriotism came from the idea of freedom and freedom fighters. I think the American Patriots, by the way, and they got a football team called it the Patriots. But the Americans who fought against Britain in the American Revolution in the 1770s called themselves patriots. They were defending their country as freedom fighters. And I think that's a much better way of thinking about that. I had a quote from somebody, if I can just find the quote a second, from somebody who, the French party, France Insoumise, which is a French left populist party. It means France Unbound. It doesn't call itself a socialist party, it doesn't call itself a communist party. It's led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and they won 7.7 million votes in the French presidential elections. They did exactly what Galloway said. Mélenchon and his party gave themselves an alternative to Marine Le Pen's party. You've got the right populism in Marine Le Pen, but you've got counterposed against it with almost as many votes, I would say, maybe more votes, I'm not sure. You have France Unbound, France Insoumise. Raquel Guirado, who's the national spokesperson for France Insoumise, says the following. Patriotism, she says, should not be confused with nationalism. We are patriotic, not nationalist. Patriotism is love for one's own, while nationalism involves hatred for others. She continues, the far right is nationalist, we are patriotic. And patriotism is an empathy and affect towards one's compatriots. We really think that insofar as our nation has been a civic nation since the French Revolution, it is not defined by any religion or skin color or even language. It is universal. Our homeland, patrie, is Republican, she says. So here's a way of formulating an idea of patriotism, which is not the same as nationalism. And so one can argue that, and Galloway was edging his way into that direction, by the way, in what he's been saying. You know, he's trying to work on or develop an idea of left patriotism, but it can lead you in the wrong direction. You've got to tread on this particular thing with great care. Lenin, of course, and I won't quote Lenin, but Lenin talks about the pride of the great Russians, and he shows that to be a socialist doesn't mean to say that you can't have pride in your own nation, but the pride in your own nation goes hand in hand with absolute hatred of all the exploiters, the czars, the princes, the capitalists. You believe in the ordinary people, you do not believe in the exploiters and the oppressors of the people. You know, and so he makes that contrast. When I write this up, I will have that quote. I won't go into that quote right now. And another thing this is perhaps my last point. We on the left tend to do reason, but what about emotion? Because we're rightly suspicious about emotions. We want to obviously have reasons, but left populism, I think, does do things like love and compassion and pride. We hate oppression. We hate exploitation. So these motions, left populism tends to grapple with. We don't shy away from them, saying we have love and compassion and pride for the right things. We hate oppression. We hate exploitation. We hate chauvinism. We hate discrimination. We hate racism. You know, so we do those emotions, which generally on the left we're a little bit suspicious about how we deal with those sorts of things, and I think left populism allows us to do that. So we can have anthems, we can sing, and we can have flags. Again, I think that's something that generally we're a bit suspicious on the left. As we know, Carol, we do a bit of flag waving of our own, and we also do Jerusalem, as we think that should be an anthem that we should all sing with pride, and we think that's the anthem that English Republicans should sing, I would say. So, if I'm going to come to the end now, Carol, I think summary and conclusions, and just to finish it off here, the summary and conclusion is this: we need a left populist mass party. George Galloway is right on that. We need to focus on the nation of England. That an analysis says that we should do that. England is the most backward part of the UK. We need a big movement in England where the majority of people live. We must focus on that. Another England is possible. We can do patriotism if it's done in the right way, not as chauvinism, not as nationalism, but as love of the good things, the positive things. Yes, we can do emotions, love and hate, flags and anthems. We can do all those things, which are not that if we're going to do a mass party, we have to take all these things into account in forging a party that can actually appeal to a much broader mass of the population than the very narrow kind of dogma that you get on the left. And I'll end on this final point. I had this thing called flooding the zone. We need to flood the zone. If we as a Republican Labour Education Forum, we need to flood the zone of left populism with colour, and and our left populism is based on our history, and that means we've got the levelers in there, we've got the Chartists in there, and we've got the suffragettes in there, and that's how we have to go. We have to go out as a Republican Labour Education Forum and make a case for a left populist party, bringing together a lot of the things that we've been talking about. And I believe that can be a mass politics, actually, for the people in England. We've got a great historical tradition of democracy, and we need to mobilise that. And that way, I believe we can contest with reform as an alternative, as a left alternative to the Labour Party. I think we can. I think it's possible to do that. And I'm going to finish there, Carol, at that point.
So thank you very much indeed, Steve. That was excellent. And you've totally convinced me that we do need left populism, because otherwise we're going to end up with right populism, and then that's going to transform into fascism. So thank you very much indeed, Steve, for that very enlightening talk.